From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, theZoomer with Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to the special edition of theZoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, following months of military buildup on the border. The country of nearly 45 million people, strategically positioned here between Russia and its ally Belarus to the northeast, and the rest of Europe, including the swath of European nations here to the west. To date, millions of refugees have crossed into Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland. Meanwhile, millions more are displaced within their own country. Of particular concern are those trapped in conflict zones along Ukraine's northeast, east, and southeast border. The humanitarian crisis both within and beyond the borders of Ukraine is dire and intensifying by the day. And that's where we begin tonight. But before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
In Russia, look no further than the petroleum industry to see how Vladimir Putin's economic and political power is fueled. Most of Russia's exports are oil and gas. The European Union gets 40% of its natural gas imports and more than 1/4 of its oil from Russia, with Eastern Europe being highly reliant. Germany also gets about 60% of its natural gas from Russia, equal to about 9% of Russia's overall exports. And until recently, 8% of U.S. imports of oil and refined products, or about 600,000 barrels a day, came from Russia. In total, these revenues make up half of the Kremlin's budget, fueling Putin's army, and also tragedy for millions of Ukrainians.
Millions have so far fled Ukraine, that number projected to be around 5 or 6 million over the next few weeks. This is without a doubt a huge humanitarian crisis. Let's head now to the Poland-Ukraine border, where Majid Al-Shafi, president and founder of One Free World International, is standing by. Majid, it is so good to see you. Give us an update from on the ground. What's going on there?
It's a horrible situation, and it's getting by worse. Today, Russia widened its attack on Ukrainian cities, which led to more refugees to flee. We are talking about 100,000 refugees per day. That's more than 2.5 million so far. 1.6 of them crosses the border to Poland. Just for you to have an understanding, only 40% of them comes here by cars, 60% of them by foot. That's around 10 miles. And 10 to 15 below zero. Just 2 weeks ago, 6 Ukrainians died frozen. Here you have the welcome center when they arrive, and their first glimpse of hope. I saw mothers kissing their children goodbye as they are saying goodbye. I saw wives. I saw kids saying goodbye to their fathers. It's really one of the worst humanitarian cases that I ever saw in my life. And I'm a man that I go to Afghanistan, but to see children saying goodbye to their father, to their mother, was not an easy to watch.
You've been in war zones before, but for these mothers and their children, this must be terrifying for them.
Absolutely, and to see that this is happening, if you look in their faces, their dreams are shattered. They left their home, they left their history, their land, their friends, their loved ones behind, and they are coming to the unknown. They are coming where they don't know where they will be staying. They don't know if they will be able to return one day to their home country.
Far more life-threatening, Majid, is the situation on the ground in Ukraine. And I know you have plans to head there and that you have teams currently on the ground. We've seen these horrific images of bodies on the streets, people in bunkers without access to electricity or water, melting snow to drink. What are you doing to make sure aid reaches some of those besieged cities?
We are bringing from Poland, we are bringing humanitarian aid, water, clean water, clothing, food, medical supplies. and we was able to obtain. And by tomorrow, we will be in Ukraine to deliver this to the front lines. And the most important thing is the wounded soldiers as well. Many of the hospitals full of wounded soldiers that have no medication, have nothing to treat them, and people is dying every single day.
Majid, I want to ask you about the humanitarian corridors. Are you hopeful that these stay open? Because we've also seen them be the target of Russian attacks. I mean, put into perspective for us just how dangerous these corridors are for people who are stuck in Ukraine.
Like most of the tyrants, the more that they are losing, the more they will increase their attack. He is disregarding any human right. He is disregarding any human life. Civilians now become a target. Hospitals become a target. Children's hospitals become a target. It's a war crime, and it's really, to see the world doesn't even allow the Ukrainians to have no-fly zone and to protect their sky, and just to remain silent is really appalling. Sanctions is not working as fast as possible. Sanctions will have an effect, but in the long run, will not have an effect now. And Putin will continue to simply nobody standing against him, and the NATO is not doing enough. And that's what we see from the Ukrainian people here. They are saying this over and over, that nobody is with us. We are completely alone.
What do the refugees need right now? And we're seeing this humanitarian crisis grow not only in Poland, where you are, but in Moldova, in Hungary, in Slovakia. Are these countries prepared to take on this load of refugees? And what do they need?
They don't have another choices. Some of these countries is well equipped, like Poland. I believe that they are doing an amazing job. Moldova and other countries, they have a very smaller budget, very limited resources, and they are struggling themselves as a nation. So imagine with all of these refugees, they are really struggling in order to support them.
Okay, Majid, thank you for what you're doing over there. Please stay safe. When we come back, Roman Waschuk, former ambassador of Canada to Ukraine, he's up next. Welcome back. Russia's invasion of Ukraine isn't its first incursion there in recent years. Right here is the Crimean Peninsula, just south of Ukraine's mainland, stretching into the Black Sea, which was annexed in 2014 by the Russians. Shortly after Putin took over Crimea, my next guest was appointed ambassador of Canada to Ukraine. Roman Waschuk served from 2014 to 2019, is currently in Krakow, Poland, after fleeing the Russian invasion. Ambassador, thank you for being with us. I'm glad to see that you're doing well. Ukrainians have a famously rebellious spirit and a history of protesting. Corruption and Russian influence look no further than the Orange Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. Now, as ambassador, you would know firsthand the determination and readiness of Ukrainians to die in order to choose their own destiny. And I think we're seeing that today, are we not?
We certainly are. Ukrainians are a hard to govern bunch of people. That means it's frustrating for those who want to do quick reforms because they don't just knuckle under and do even always the right thing. They'd rather do their own thing. And certainly they're not interested in having somebody like Vladimir Putin telling them what to do. So regardless of language, regardless of region, and we're seeing this across the country, in the south and in the east, Ukrainians are saying, get out of our lives, get out of our country. If we are going to have change in our country, we're going to do it ourselves. We don't need neighbors rolling in and bombing us to smithereens to achieve that.
I want to ask you about this no-fly zone. What do you think the likelihood of something like that happening is, and what should the West be doing?
Likelihood is currently low. There's a lot of concern about escalation, whether, for example, having a few Western planes flying around over one part of Ukraine or the whole country might prompt Putin to go nuclear. And he certainly warned against that. I'm wondering whether he's not playing with our minds in this case and engaging in what might be called self-deterrence, where we basically scare ourselves into not doing things to help. There was the idea of transferring jet airplanes, old Soviet models from neighboring countries. That also has been scrapped. At the moment, it looks like the best hope for protecting Ukrainians from brutal attacks from the skies is to deliver them advanced anti-aircraft systems that would help take down the Russian planes that are currently wreaking havoc in places like Mariupol, where they're bombing children's hospitals and maternity wards and basically behaving absolutely brutally.
Well, but do you think that fears of escalation are valid, or do you think they're misplaced?
You know, I think they always have to be in our minds. It's partly a question of whether we feel we're in this conflict or not. It's comforting to think that we're uninvolved and simply concerned bystanders, but I think in Putin's eyes, he is waging war against the West on Ukrainian territory. And the more successfully he's in doing that, the more he will be tempted to cross new red lines and challenge NATO allies, neutral countries like Finland and Sweden in more threatening ways. So it's partly a question of when do you take the risk? At an earlier phase, when it's in Ukraine, or at a later phase, when it might be much more direct in terms of us and our allies.
Well, and it's quite likely he could invade one of the tiny Baltic regions, in which case it would trigger Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. So to your point, is it better we do it now, or is it better we do it later? How many people die in the meantime?
Well, right. This is obviously the civilian casualty toll is growing. The Russians are using their Syria playbook of basically pummeling cities into the ground. Frankly, I have to say, as pessimistic and as I was about the Russians and what they're up to, I didn't think they'd take it to this level. They have. So I think countries should be as forward-leaning as possible without being reckless. So I certainly think the jet aircraft transfer makes sense. Maybe setting up a region in the West. One of the few airports that hasn't been blasted is in the city of Lviv. Maybe declare it a humanitarian corridor. The airspace there is uncontested. So don't take an all or nothing approach to these things. Figure out how far we can lean forward to help people, to help the Ukrainians, frankly, also win, because they are doing well on the ground. They've got air cover problems. They've still got an operational air force. So it doesn't take a whole lot to tip the balance in their favor.
Before I let you go, there are 11 million Ukrainians with family in Russia who are being told a very different version of events that's occurring here on the ground. According to Putin, Nazis have taken over Ukraine. They have not taken responsibility for what you mentioned, the attack on the maternity ward. How is that playing into this war? And is Putin really manipulating in the minds of Russians?
Certainly is. He's managed to create what is now nearly a hermetic sort of information environment. I was traveling for part of my journey west with a lady who has a number of relatives in Russia, and she was going out of her mind because she was calling them up and telling them, and they weren't believing her. They were saying, what you're saying doesn't fit what we're seeing on TV, and we believe the TV, and we don't believe you. So that's, in fact, the power that media in the hands of a dictator has.
Ambassador, we really appreciate you taking the time. When we come back, our panel is next to break it all down. Welcome back. Vladimir Putin has made numerous factually dubious claims about Ukraine, most notably in his notorious essay published last year in which he sets out to prove that Ukrainians and Russians are, quote, one people. He's also talked about NATO enlargement as a serious provocation that would justify a serious Russian response. So did the West underestimate his threats? How did we get here? We start there with our panel, Oral Braun, Igor Kozak, Andrei Zaranyak, and John Robson. Thank you all for being here. Oral, let me start with you. There seemed to be this sense of profound shock when Putin invaded Ukraine, and yet Putin never hid the fact that he believed in aggressive Russian nationalism. Did we take his threats seriously enough when he's really been telling us all along what he intended to do?
Well, it's given us many signals, whether it was the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the invasion of Ukraine, and the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. And we did not take the necessary step to disabuse him of this kind of fantasy of rebuilding an empire. He has failed in many ways domestically. And so he has looked for external adventures to compensate for that, to divert attention away. He is an extremely ruthless leader domestically, but he's not reckless. He looks for weakness. And what we have done is we have projected weakness.
When Putin amassed 100,000 troops on the border, Eeyore, why didn't the West respond sooner? Were there steps they could have taken to deter this? Or was it a foregone conclusion that he'd invade?
Well, I think absolutely. It's, as was already stated here, Putin has been planning all along. He stated once that collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and he was planning to rebuild the Soviet Union and build the new Russian Empire. Since 2014, he'd been doing all kind of horrible things in Ukraine, and as of late, U.S. intelligence had a very clear indications for at least 2-3 months. They've been talking about it publicly, President Biden specifically, about this invasion is about to happen. I have been advocating since 2014, and many experts and intelligence agencies have been talking about that it's necessary to deter Putin, meaning to implement serious sanctions, not half measures, since 2014, to arm Ukraine preemptively in order to deter this aggression. And I believe if that was to be done, then we wouldn't be in this horrible situation now where we have a full-fledged war in the heart of Europe and a human tragedy that we haven't seen since World War II.
We will take a look at some of those sanctions in a minute, but first, Andrei, I have to, how do you read Putin's ambitions? Is he looking to dismember the country, or is he going for more of a maximalist outcome here? How do you read him?
I think his goal is destruction of Ukraine. And I think that his behavior is more and more erratic. It's no longer about calculations and some games with the Russian public. No, he believes that Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia, and he wants to destroy the country and the Ukrainian nation.
President Zelensky, John, recently walked back his stance on NATO in an interview with an American news organization, saying he'd cooled down on Ukraine's bid to join NATO. What do you make of that shift? Is that an olive branch, and is that the right call? Is that the right decision?
It seems to me that it's a prudent thing to say in a situation that I think is a lot more dangerous than a lot of people somehow managed to grasp. Going back to your earlier question, yeah, we did this to ourselves by failing to take Putin seriously. When John Kerry had that very revealing remark, I thought we lived in a world that had said no to this kind of thing, which wasn't so much wrong as just meaningless. And so now we're engaged in a confrontation very close to the Russian heartland with a nation that has thousands of nuclear weapons. And you can't just say, oh, well, we don't like Putin, I guess we should get rid of him, even though the world would be a much better place if he weren't the president of Russia. And so the question now is, because the war is going badly for the Russians, how do we give Putin a way out that doesn't make him think the world has ended, I'm going to be overthrown, my colleagues are going to put a bullet in the back of my head, I might as well use nuclear weapons? And some kind of withdrawal in return for a nominal demilitarization of Ukraine. I mean, it's not fair, but it does avoid the most appalling possible escalations. And it's irresponsible not to take those seriously.
You disagree?
I absolutely disagree with that, Melissa. I believe you just stated here that we got to this point by being weak, by not doing the right things all along. And I think what you're suggesting here, we're playing right into Putin's scenario. He absolutely wants to see more weakness. And I believe if he swallows Ukraine, he is going to move into the NATO countries, into the Baltic states, into Poland. And I also do not believe that Putin is going to start here World War III. It is easy for him to kill his own people, to kill innocent Ukrainians, but the destruction of himself, he loves himself too much. He has too much to lose. His regime, he's using nuclear as a threat, but I do not believe he's going to push that button.
Oral, I have 30 seconds left. Last word to you.
I can appreciate the fact that we want to engage in diplomacy and we want to avoid a major conflict. But the problem is that Vladimir Putin has rejected all off-ramps. He has stopped Macron. He has made it very clear he wants all of Ukraine. So we cannot play both sides of the chessboard It's just not going to work. We have to face the reality that Putin has to be defeated.
All right, quick break. We'll be right back on the other side. Welcome back. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has repeatedly urged Western allies to impose a no-fly zone over all of Ukraine, which would essentially give it air support. Justin Trudeau, our Canadian Prime Minister, has recently rejected his request over fears it could mark a significant escalation in the war. So too has the U.S. and NATO leaders. Let's bring back the panel. Igor, I want to get your reaction to President Zelensky's repeated calls for a no-fly zone. And do you agree with the risk assessment that it will lead to an escalation?
President Zelensky has been asking over the past 2 weeks for no-fly zone for a simple reason, because Ukraine, unfortunately, do not control their airspace. And we see now, or especially the past week, that the Russian strategy has been failing or stalling on the ground. They have been increasingly using airspace, firing missiles, rockets, using indiscretionary bombings on the civilian targets, specifically now hitting civilian targets, schools, hospitals, kindergartens, and this will continue. It will only increase as Putin cannot advance significantly on the ground. Ukraine needs no-fly zone, and many people have been asking for this, not only President Zelensky.
John, it's rooted in this idea that it could lead to NATO getting involved in a conflict, a third world war. But at the moment, our ally, Ukraine, is getting annihilated. So do we need to rethink our framing here?
Well, it's important to understand that imposing a no-fly zone isn't something that could lead to a war. It would be a war. The Soviet Air Force has about, I think, about 1,000 at least fixed-wing fighter aircraft, so Canada can't do anything. Britain and France have a couple of hundred. Basically, you're talking about the United States Air Force going in there, blowing the Russian Air Force out of the sky in order to inflict a crushing defeat on Russian ground forces. And again, I want to emphasize, I understand that showing weakness is a terrible idea and that we can't let Putin swallow Ukraine. The exit option here has to be that Russia withdraws from Ukraine. But if we were to do such a thing, why would the Russians not use tactical nuclear weapons against the staging air bases elsewhere in Europe from which they are being defeated in a war? This is not the sort of thing that you can do, even though it makes you so frustrated and you feel so helpless watching the carnage and knowing that Putin is a bad guy with an insatiable appetite.
But at the same time, Putin understands the concept of mutually assured destruction. And is it realistic to assume he'll bow out of Ukraine? I mean, what alternatives are there?
We have to be very careful not to assume that what in international relations theory is called the bad man theory, that Vladimir Putin wants to project this kind of irrationality is the reality. Vladimir Putin is a kleptocrat. He's not a theocrat. He doesn't want to have a nuclear war which would destroy Russia as well as the rest of the world, or much of the world, just to get Ukraine, as important as Ukraine is. That is why we have nuclear deterrence. That is why it has to be pointed out to Mr. Putin, don't make threats with nuclear weapons. We have them as well, and that's the reason we have them. So we should not constantly engage in this kind of self-limitation. We are, in a sense, already involved. The demands that Vladimir Putin is making are not only against Ukraine. We have to listen to what he's saying. He's demanding at the same time as the so-called denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. He's asking essentially for the demilitarization of the eastern part of NATO. He's saying, I want to have all NATO forces removed, Western NATO forces removed from Eastern Europe, from the Baltic states. So the Canadian contingent from Latvia would have to go. We could not even have troops on a rotating basis. That would mean that the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, all this would be utterly vulnerable to Russia. So where exactly do we stop in trying to accommodate Mr. Putin? And the only one in the West who really has had a strategy is not Mr. Biden, who has shown astonishing weakness and ineptness, but it has been Boris Johnson, who said something really seminal. He said Vladimir Putin's invasion has to fail and be seen to fail.
Andrei, the West, the U.S. in particular, just put an end to Poland sending in fighter jets. Now there are discussions about the potential use of chemical weapons. At what point do we say, to hell with escalations, we need to put a stop to this guy?
The point has passed. The no-fly zone, the help to Ukraine, it's not just about military support to the Ukrainian army. It's about saving Ukraine's civilians. According to the Ukrainian stats, Ukrainian civilian casualties greatly outnumber military. I mean, it's a genocidal war. So the escalation is happening because the West is not doing enough to stop this war.
John, I'll give final word to you, and I'd like you to comment really about this fear that we have that Putin could launch his attacks further afield.
Well, this is a significant problem. I mean, again, it's easy to say we should have deterred him sooner, and we certainly should have. We need to have NATO troops in the way of any further expansion so that he starts the shooting war or backs down. But we really do have to avoid a nuclear exchange. And again, it's not like suddenly all the missiles get launched. It's a series of escalations. If we are conducting military operations from outside Ukraine's borders, then Putin may strike at the assets that we're using, and tactical nuclear weapons could get used. And none of this is to deny that civilians are being killed, that Russia's staging false flag operations, that Putin's ambitions are immensely dangerous. That's all very true. But it's still, there are things you can't do no matter how much you want to, saying, let's just put a stop to this. If that leads to an exchange of nuclear weapons throughout Europe or even intercontinentally, we put a stop to everything. And
so where do you draw a red line?
It's not responsible to say we should just do this and to heck with the consequences.
Yes, but
where do you draw a red line? If the Putin invades Baltic states as a part of NATO, Poland tomorrow, are we going to still stay with this rhetoric that because he possesses nuclear arms and it could be World War III, that we should let Putin take Baltic states, take Poland?
Well, no, of course not. They're NATO allies. We have troops in the Baltic states. We shoot back. And he knows it. We should have let Ukraine into NATO years ago, but we didn't, right? You have to start from where you are.
I don't know that I'm necessarily confident NATO will. I mean, would an invasion of Latvia trigger Article 5 of NATO?
Yes, unquestionably.
I mean, that's the deal.
Article 5 is not that clear. It doesn't say exactly what you have to do. So everything's subject to interpretation. And this is the nature of international law. So if you look at international law, look at the interpretation, we haven't talked about the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine in 1994 gave up what was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for assurances, not just from Russia, but also from Britain and the United States, that its territorial integrity and sovereignty would be respected. The Biden administration seems to have amnesia over this. And so what do guarantees mean? What does deterrence mean?
All right, I have to leave it there. We need to take a quick break. More to come. Stay with us. Welcome back. The idea that Putin has been the beneficiary of selling energy to the West, which has filled his coffers and fueled his war against Ukraine, is nothing new. How the West ought to respond to that threat, however, has been a point of debate. Have existing economic sanctions been enough? And what does a rethinking of existing energy policies really look like for Canada and the West more broadly? Let's bring back the panel. Ihor, I'll start with you there.
Clearly, they haven't been enough because Putin hasn't stopped this war against Ukraine. In fact, he is escalating. Sanctions obviously is an important tool in our toolbox, but they do take time to work, and it's questionable whether they're going to will work. Look at Western sanctions against Cuba, Iran, North Korea. Have they been difficult for those countries? Yes. Have they worked? No. So the same type of situation. Secondly, we led ourselves to this, sad scenario where Europe is so dependent, 40% of European Union dependent on the Russian natural gas. There are some European countries who are 100% dependent, not to mention everything else. The war in Ukraine been since 2014. The sanctions implemented today were only half measures, and now we're trying to be reactive. And is it working? Not so far. Will it work? Hopefully.
John, those on the left will say developing renewables is the only way forward, but are we perpetuating this myth that wind and solar are reliable enough to replace oil and gas?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this crisis came about partly because we believed in unicorn power, both geopolitically and in the field of energy. And what the European nations need to start doing, and this will not solve the immediate crisis, and I agree that we need to help supply the Ukrainian armed forces and drive the Russians out of Ukraine, but the Europeans need to start fracking and they need to start building nuclear plants. The one form of reliable alternative energy that really doesn't create a lot of greenhouse gases, and it's the test of sanity for a climate alarmist. Do you or don't you support nuclear energy? I mean, I could get on to the fact that, we have done all this to ourselves over an imaginary climate crisis, and we've done it while China keeps burning more and more coal, so it wouldn't work even if they were right about their assumptions. This has just been a departure from reality. And for the Europeans to hold themselves hostage to Vladimir Putin, and everybody saw it coming except them. But for goodness sakes, build pipelines to get Canadian oil and Canadian natural gas to the world instead of relying on Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela.
A big misstep. Andre, no question Russia's economy has taken a hit. Before the war, it took 80 rubles to make $1. Now it's 119. Is there any way in which Russians rebel against Putin because of this?
Well, I don't see it happening. We saw protests in Russian cities. We had lots of brave people protesting the war, but they all were arrested. I mean, Putin built up not only his military, but also his police forces. And I think he is in control of the situation in Russia. Moreover, those protesters are actually a minority. If you look at the polls, the majority of Russians actually support this war in Ukraine, at least now. It may change eventually, but I think that kind of national mobilization around Putin and shift towards, let's call it, totalitarianism from authoritarianism is a more likely scenarios.
Oral, on the other hand, I mean, could sanctions have the opposite effect and actually turn Russians against the U.S. in support of Putin?
Some of that is happening already, and this is what the Putin regime is hoping to do, to say to the people of Russia, you see, we have told you that we are encircled. We have told you that the West is against us. I'm the one who is defending you against these sanctions. So sanctions only do limited things. We have to understand that the record of sanctions internationally is not a particularly good one. It's very rare that the sanctions have turned around major policy. And when they did, it usually was in combination with other elements. Mr. Biden had a press conference almost 2 weeks ago before the war, a little bit more than 2 weeks ago before the war started. He was asked about the sanctions. Are these going to deter Russia? He said, oh, no, they were not meant to deter Russia. But, you know, come back in a month, come back in 2 months, see what happens. Well, by then there may be no Ukraine. So sanctions have to work together with military power. It has to be a combination. If Russia is losing on the ground and there are sanctions and they are implemented fully, and they have not been fully implemented, then gradually opinion may change. People may begin to ask questions. Something is really wrong.
All right, good discussion. Ihor Kozak, Oral Braun, Andrei Zaranyak, and John Robson, thank you. When we come back, I speak with Russian conductor Daniel Ricekin, whose wife and mother-in-law escaped the city of Kharkiv when the war broke out. He joins me next.
Irina is just one of millions of Ukrainians that have found themselves in desperate need as they flee their home in an effort to escape the war with Russia. And once again, Toronto's own Global Medic, one of the world's leading humanitarian organizations, is doing their part to help those in need.
We know that 1.7 million have walked across a border and become refugees. We don't even know how many are actually displaced, but it's a significant portion of the country. Inside the country, our teams are doing things like running community kitchens. So in a city like Lviv, where people are fleeing the fighting and then arriving at the train station, we're just giving them some comfort food, just a little bit of chicken and rice or fish and rice and some salad and soup just to warm their bellies and fill them while they decide what they do next.
And here at the Global Medic Warehouse just outside of Toronto, volunteers are packing up various medical supplies destined for a hospital in Lviv. But what makes this urgent delivery much more difficult than usual is getting the goods like these first aid kits not only into the country, but through a war zone.
A plane will fly from Toronto to Warsaw. 20 skids of this stuff will get unloaded at that airport in Warsaw. We'll grab it by truck. The plan is to truck it into Lviv. Imagine how hard this is, meeting another Sprinter van at the side of the road in a war zone and transferring the products from your van into theirs and trying to do that 17 times all at once at 4 in the morning, and then that van carries it further into Kyiv, into Kharkiv, and all these other cities that are in the middle of the fight.
It's horrible. I can sleep, I can eat. I used to go to med school there for 3 years, so I know many people that are doctors there, so I know from firsthand what they need and what's going on there.
If you got diabetes or high blood pressure and you fled your home, you didn't take your meds with you. So we're just going through and making sure that we have those meds ready. We'll get them in. But then we also need trauma gear. You know, bandages, gauze, this kind of stuff, because we know people are getting, shot and injured and hurt. Abdominal pads, sterile pads. Like, so if you've been shot in the stomach, right, this is the type of dressing that we're going to treat you with.
To find out how you can help by making a donation or volunteering with this incredible organization, visit globalmedic.ca. In Toronto, I'm Darren Maharaj for Zoomer News.
Thanks, Darren. My next guest says his wife and mother-in-law took a 40-hour-long train from Kharkiv under constant shelling to get it to safety. Daniel Ricekin, music director of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, joins me now from Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. Daniel, it's good to see you. What was that journey like, that 40-hour-long train ride? Did they have access to water or to food? And did you ever lose contact with them?
Well, I had a very sketchy contact because my wife was very afraid of losing the battery of the phone. And you should imagine that in 4-persons compartment of the train, they were with 11 people and a cat and a young girl who was terribly scared. They had water, they had some food that each and every of them took whatever they could grab in the last moment. But it was lots of anxiety because the train would be moving very slow and then stop, and then they will hear the rounds of artillery and bombardment, and then they will stop for about 2 hours on the station in Kyiv, which was, as you know, was and is still besieged by Russian forces. And they were ordered to switch off. The lights were switched off. The windows were supposed to be closed and draped, and the phones were supposed to switch off. And people actually were sitting in silence and no communication. So they were real moments of fear and terror, and people were incredibly cooperative. People who never knew each other before, they cramped in a small space. They were sharing the possibility of lying down here and now for half an hour and then establishing the rotation. And then once in a while, I will get a one-word message from my wife, which will indicate a village or a town or a city they would be passing. So I would be looking at Google Maps and just tracking the progress of their journey.
Daniel, did you ever think you might not see her again?
Oh yeah, many occasions. And particularly when a day before they left, she called me, and I barely could hear her because the sounds of shelling and bombing was so loud in the background. This is when you have this distinct animal-like fear that something which is so close and dear to you will just be smashed and lost forever. So it's I wouldn't be able to translate it into words, this fear and terror, and I believe that the one they experienced on this journey was times more aggravated. But this is something you won't wish to your most vicious enemy. This.
Before I let you go, what message would you like to give to Mr. Putin if you had an opportunity to speak to him?
Oh, there's so many things. First of all, I would not want to speak to him at all, but I think that he's scared for sure, and he doesn't know what he's doing. And every dictator has always thought in the history that they would be smarter than the ones that did make it. And I think he drags two great countries with him into this complete unknown. But for me, seeing the destruction and the pain of completely innocent people, actually on both sides, but mainly in Ukraine now, is something that I find absolutely not fitting a human soul and human. So this should stop immediately. And if Russia wants to be remembered for the great things it has contributed to the world history and universal values, it should raise, its citizens should raise en masse, go to the streets, not being afraid. You can't imprison millions, you can imprison hundreds. So I call on my compatriots, being still a Russian citizen who doesn't know if I ever will see my elderly parents who are 86 and they're in St. Petersburg, where I'm from, talking to you and naming things by their name, I'm quite sure to not having access to them for a while. But I'm calling on my compatriots to take a stand, take to the streets, not being afraid, open their eyes and hearts before it's too late.
Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing your story.
Thank you for having me.
All right, before we go, a personal note. This here is a picture of my grandmother, aunt, uncle, and cousin when they arrived in Canada from Ukraine in 1930. They left at a time when Stalin was carrying out his policy of collectivization, a deliberate policy decision to starve Ukrainians, which led to the genocide of 6 to 10 million people. Russia has never accepted that Ukraine is its own sovereign state, and today Putin is propagating that. We cannot forget the promise the West made to aid Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum, which agreed that Ukraine's decision to surrender all its nuclear weapons meant it deserved security and protection. So let's stop tiptoeing around this murderer and give Ukraine the security and the protection it really needs. That's it for time. A big thank you to my panel for being here. We'll see you soon. It's time to zoom out.